November 1944, Western Europe. Just before dawn, the forest is still. Cold air hangs low between bare trees, carrying the smell of wet leaves and damp earth. Breath fogs briefly, then disappears. Boots are planted carefully, soles pressed into mud that has learned to swallow sound. A U.S. Ranger patrol lies motionless along a narrow road cut through the trees. Rifles are aimed, but not raised. Fingers rest outside triggers. No one speaks. No one moves. Then voices drift in. German voices, close, casual, unhurried. Through the trees, shapes emerge, helmets, rifles, packs. Then more and more. A column, stretching far beyond what the Rangers expected. Dozens of men. 70, maybe 80. Too many to count now. Too many to stop. The patrol leader does not cancel the ambush. He waits. The Germans step deeper into the road bend, exactly where the ground narrows and sight lines collapse. The column compresses. Spacing disappears. Confidence replaces caution. A single hand lifts the forest, explodes. Gunfire shatters the silence. Shouts replace conversation. The German column freezes, stunned by fire coming from nowhere. In seconds, chaos replaces order. But even as the ambush reaches its peak, the Rangers are already thinking ahead, because killing was never the objective. Surviving. What comes next is by late 1944, the Western Front had entered a phase defined by exhaustion and pressure. After the breakout from Normandy and the rapid advance across France, Allied momentum slowed as supply lines stretched and German resistance hardened. The enemy no longer fought to hold territory alone. They fought to delay, disrupt, and bleed advancing forces wherever possible. This created a fragmented battlefield. Front lines were no longer clean. Units operated ahead of main formations, often separated by forests, villages, and road networks that offered both concealment and danger. In these gaps, small unit actions became decisive not for capturing ground, but for shaping what happened next. German forces relied increasingly on movement. Columns shifted at night or dawn. Reinforcements moved along secondary roads. Supply units traveled with minimal escort. Commanders assumed that Allied spearheads were elsewhere, focused on larger objectives. That assumption was risky. The Allies, particularly the Americans, had learned that momentum depended on information. Knowing where German units were moving and in what strength often mattered more than destroying them outright. This was the environment in which patrol warfare thrived. Units moved quietly, observed patiently, and struck selectively. Engagements were brief by design. The goal was not to hold ground, but to unsettle the enemy, extract intelligence, and vanish before superior forces could respond. No unit embodied this approach more fully than the United States Army Rangers. By 1944, Ranger units had already earned a reputation across multiple theaters. They were not conventional infantry. They were trained to operate independently, behind or between enemy lines, with minimal support and maximum autonomy. Their missions emphasized speed, surprise, and withdrawal over sustained combat. Rangers did not fight battles. They fought moments. German commanders understood this in theory, but the scale of the front made constant vigilance impossible. Columns still moved, assuming security in numbers. Patrols still relaxed when no enemy was visible. Roads were still treated as corridors rather than traps. The terrain encouraged this. Complacency, forests and narrow roads limited visibility. Elevation changes and bends in the ground broke sight lines. A unit moving through such terrain could feel alone even when the enemy was close. For a Ranger patrol, this was opportunity. Ambushes were not about annihilation. They were about shock-delivering violence so suddenly that the enemy lost coherence. Confusion multiplied casualties faster than firepower ever could, but ambushes carried risk. Once the first shots were fired, time became the enemy. German units outnumbered Ranger patrols almost by definition. If the Rangers lingered, they would be surrounded. If they misjudged enemy strength, escape routes could vanish. This balance between aggression and restraint defined Ranger operations dawn in November 1944. as Allied forces pressed deeper into Western Europe and German units maneuvered desperately to hold ground. That balance would be tested in a way few patrols ever faced, because on that narrow forest road, the Rangers did not encounter a handful of soldiers. They encountered a force large, enough to destroy them lest everything went exactly as planned. Ranger patrols were built for decisions, made far from headquarters. Training emphasized independence to an extreme degree. Patrol leaders were taught not to wait for permission once they crossed friendly lines. Radios were limited. Support was distant. The expectation was clear. If contact was made, the men on the ground would solve it themselves. This philosophy shaped everything Rangers did. Patrols were kept small on purpose. Fewer men meant less noise, fewer tracks, and faster movement. Each Ranger carried more responsibility, not less. Every man was expected to understand the plan, the withdrawal routes, and the signals for breaking contact. Ambush doctrine reflected this. Mindset Rangers were taught to strike where the enemy felt, safest on roads, at bends, near terrain that forced movement into predictable channels. Fire was concentrated, violent, and brief. The goal was to convince the enemy they had walked into something far larger than reality. But ambush was only half the operation. Withdrawal mattered more. Before a single shot was fired, escape routes were planned in detail. Secondary paths were marked. Rally points were chosen. Timings were rehearsed. Rangers understood that once surprise faded, numbers would decide the fight, and they would lose that fight if they stayed. Asterisk. German forces moving through contested areas did not always anticipate this level of coordination. By late 1944, many German units were operating under pressure, often reconstituted from remnants of earlier formations. Columns included a mix of combat troops, support personnel, and replacements with varying experience levels. Movement emphasized speed over security in forests and rural road networks. German patrol discipline often relaxed. Advance guards were reduced. Flank security was minimal. The assumption was that Allied units were concentrated elsewhere. This assumption proved dangerous. Ranger patrol observing such movement would not engage blindly. They watched spacing. They counted heads. They noted weapons and posture. An ambush was only triggered when terrain, timing, and enemy behavior aligned. What made the November encounter exceptional was scale. The patrol expected a small detachment. Instead, the column kept coming. Dozens of men moved into the kill zone before the full size of the force became clear. At that point, aborting the ambush carried its own risk. Movement would be detected. Withdrawal could turn into pursuit. The patrol leader faced a decision measured in seconds. Proceed and rely on shock to create an opening, or withdraw under observation and risk. Being hunted immediately, Ranger doctrine did not promise safety. It promised options. The patrol chose the option that preserved initiative. They would strike hard, fast, and in a way that suggested strength far beyond their actual numbers. Then they would disappear before the Germans could recover. This was not bravery for its own sake. It was calculation. And as the Rangers settled back into position after the first shots echoed through the forest, everything they had been trained for narrowed into one objective: break contact on their terms. Because once the ambush was sprung, the clock would start, and it would not stop until either the Rangers were gone or surrounded. Fear arrived before the first shot. It came in the counting. Helmets passing through branches, boots striking packed earth. The realization that the column was not ending, that what had been expected to be a handful of soldiers had become dozens, far more than the patrol could reasonably face. Rangers were trained to control fear, not eliminate it. Each man understood what the numbers meant. If the ambush failed to shock the column into paralysis, there would be no drawn-out fight. There would be no heroic stand. There would be a brief, violent collapse under weight of numbers. That knowledge sharpened focus. There was no panic, because panic wastes time. Instead, there was a narrowing of attention. Each Ranger locked into his assigned sector, his timing, his exit route. Breathing slowed, muscles stayed loose. The world shrank to meters of road and arcs of fire. Trust mattered more than courage. Every man trusted that the others would fire when signaled, trusted that no one would fire early, trusted that when the moment came to break contact, no one would hesitate or look back. This trust had been built long before the patrol ever entered the forest through training, repetition, and shared understanding. Of consequence, when the patrol leader raised his hand, the fear did not disappear. It transformed. It became urgency, because in that moment, every ranger understood that survival depended not on individual bravery, but on collective discipline. One man firing late or early could unravel the plan. One man freezing could block the escape route. The ambush was not just an attack, it was a test of weather training, could override instinct under impossible odds. The ambush was shaped by geometry. The patrol selected a bend in the road where visibility collapsed inward. Trees crowded close. The road dipped slightly, forcing German soldiers to compress their spacing. Advance guards disappeared around the bend before rear elements could see what lay ahead. This created a kill zone. Fire would arrive from elevated positions on both sides, angled inward to trap the column at its narrowest point. The goal was not sustained fire, to a shock overwhelming noise and impact delivered in seconds. Rangers did not fire continuously. They fired deliberately. Automatic weapons targeted the center of the column, severing it mentally as much as physically. Riflemen focused on officers and radio operators, those most likely to restore order. Grenades were thrown not to clear ground, but to deepen confusion. The tactical objective was misdirection. The Germans needed to believe they had walked into a much larger force. Volume of fire mattered less than placement. Echoes in the forest. Amplified sound. Trees reflected gunfire unpredictably, making it difficult to locate shooters. Time was the limiting factor. Every second after the initial volley increased the chance of flanking movement or organized return fire. The patrol leader monitored this instinctively. When German fire began to stabilize, when shouting turned into commands, the ambush had reached its limit. That was the signal to leave. In Ranger doctrine, the ambush ends not when the enemy is destroyed, but when the enemy begins to think clearly again. The Germans were starting to recover, which meant that Rangers had to vanish. The forest was not background, it was the main weapon. Trees blocked sightlines and absorbed muzzle flashes. The ground sloped unevenly, forcing the German column into predictable movement, while allowing the Rangers to move laterally without exposure. Fallen leaves muffled footsteps. Thick undergrowth swallowed silhouettes. The patrol had studied this ground carefully. Escape routes did not follow the road. They cut diagonally through terrain. The Germans would avoid steep patches. Dense brush, narrow animal paths barely visible unless you already knew where they were. Terrain replaced numbers. Where? The Germans saw obstacles. The Rangers saw cover. Where the road constrained movement, the forest offered freedom. Once the ambush ended, the Rangers would not retreat as a group. They would fragment, moving in small elements toward pre-selected rally points. This mattered. German pursuit doctrine relied on visual contact and numerical pressure. Lose sight of the enemy, and momentum vanished. The forest ensured that sight would be lost quickly. Smoke and sound completed the deception. As the Rangers withdrew, noise continued briefly from positions no longer occupied. A final grenade exploded at the far end of the kill zone, drawing attention away from the true escape routes. The terrain absorbed the Rangers. Within minutes, the forest looked empty again, and that emptiness would confuse the Germans far more than the ambush itself, because a force that strikes and disappears without leaving direction behind feels larger than it is. And as the Rangers moved deeper into the woods, the success of their escape would depend on decisions made next. Decisions shaped not by terrain alone, but by leadership under pressure. Leadership at patrol level was measured in seconds. The patrol leader did not have a map spread open or a radio link to higher command. He had a mental picture of terrain, enemy behavior, and his own men's limits. His authority came not from rank alone, but from preparation shared by everyone in the patrol. When the column proved larger than expected, leadership became restraint. Calling off the ambush would have required movement that would be seen, heard, and followed. Proceeding meant risk, but it preserved surprise. The leader chose the option that kept initiative. During the ambush, he watched not the enemy, but his own plan. He counted time internally. He listened for the shift from confusion to command. In German voices, he waited for the first signs of organized. Return fire. That was the signal. Breaking contact too early would waste the shock. Too late would invite encirclement. Leadership here was timing, not bravery. When the withdrawal order came, it was simple and understood. No shouted commands, no whistles, just movement. Each ranger knew his direction, his spacing, his rally point. The patrol did not retreat in a line. It dissolved. Leadership allowed that dissolution because it had been planned. Trust replaced control. The leader did not need to see every man leave. He needed to know they would. That confidence born of training and shared understanding turned a dangerous moment into an orderly disappearance. For the Germans, the ambush felt overwhelming. Fire came from both sides and from elevation. Grenades detonated where commands should have formed. The road became a funnel of noise and confusion. Men dropped instinctively, unsure where to aim or who to follow. The immediate assumption was scale. No small patrol could produce that volume of fire, that level of coordination, or so it seemed. German soldiers believed they had encountered a prepared defensive position or a much larger force lying in wait. This misreading shaped their response. Instead of immediate pursuit, German leaders focused on stabilization. They sought to secure the road, establish firing lines, and restore order. This took time. Time the Rangers needed. When the firing stopped, it did not clarify the situation. It deepened uncertainty. Silence in the forest suggested repositioning, not withdrawal. German units hesitated to advance blindly into trees where the enemy might still be concealed. Pursuit doctrine faltered. Without clear direction of retreat, chasing the Rangers risked another ambush. Small reconnaissance elements probed the forest cautiously, finding nothing but empty ground and misleading sounds. By the time the Germans realized the ambush had been executed by a small patrol, the opportunity to pursue effectively was gone. The forest had swallowed the enemy. From the German perspective, this was not a failed patrol encounter. It was an engagement with an unseen force that struck decisively and vanished, leaving no clear path to retaliation. That impression mattered. It slowed movement along that route for days. Afterward, survival sometimes meant refusing the fight everyone expected. The Rangers did not stay to count casualties. They did not press their advantage. They did not attempt to turn shock into destruction. Doing so would have been emotionally satisfying and tactically fatal. Their moral victory lay in restraint. Ranger doctrine taught that withdrawal was not defeat. It was success measured correctly. The objective was to disrupt, delay, and confuse, then live to do it again. This ran counter to traditional ideas of battlefield honor, but modern war punished static heroics. Numbers, artillery, and reserves eventually crushed anything that stayed too long in one place. Rangers survived by understanding this earlier than most. The escape plan was not dramatic. It was methodical. Men moved in pairs and trios. Routes crossed and diverged to complicate tracking. Rally points allowed regrouping without exposing the entire patrol. Silence was enforced not by fear, but by habit. In this sense, the moral strength of the patrol was discipline. They trusted the plan more than adrenaline. They trusted each other more than instinct. And they accepted that the measure of success was absence being gone when the enemy expected pursuit. By the time the Germans organized a sweep, there was nothing left to find. The ambush had achieved its purpose. The patrol had survived intact, and as the Rangers reassembled miles away, the meaning of what they had done began to settle not as triumph, but as confirmation that small units, used correctly, could shape a battlefield far beyond their size. That understanding would be tested again soon when the moment of action gave way to consequences. November 1944, 6:18 hours. The ambush reaches its peak. The first volleys tear through the German column at point-blank range. Automatic fire rips into the center, splitting the formation before anyone understands what is happening. Grenades detonate against packed bodies and gear, turning the narrow road into a wall of noise and debris. German soldiers drop instinctively. Some return fire blindly into the trees. Others freeze, stunned by the sudden violence. Officers shout, trying to orient men who cannot see where the attack is coming from. Asterisk from the Ranger positions. Everything happens quickly. Fire is controlled. Bursts are short. Targets are chosen deliberately. The Rangers do not spray the road, they strike it. The sound of gunfire multiplies in the forest, echoing in ways that exaggerate their numbers. Seconds stretch. The German column begins to react. Machine guns are dragged forward. Rifle fire becomes more coordinated. Commands cut through the chaos. The shock is wearing off. The patrol leader feels the shift before he sees it. This is the moment Ranger doctrine exists for. He signals, asterisk, almost instantly. Fire tapers off. One final grenade detonates at the far end of the kill zone, drawing attention forward. Smoke blooms briefly, thick enough to obscure vision, but not enough to linger. Then the Rangers move. They do not run. Running draws fire. They step backward, into cover, then turn and disappear into the trees, each man following his pre-assigned route. There is no shouting, no hesitation. The ambush collapses inward on itself and vanishes. On the road, German soldiers struggle to understand what has happened. The firing has stopped too abruptly. There is no pursuing enemy, no visible withdrawal, only wounded men, shattered equipment, and silence where gunfire had been seconds earlier. Some German units attempt to push into the forest. They meet nothing. Trees block vision. Underbrush slows movement. Every shadow looks like a threat. The certainty of being watched lingers, even though the Rangers are already gone. This hesitation is decisive. By the time German commanders consider organizing a coordinated sweep, the opportunity has passed. The ambush site is already cold. Tracks led nowhere useful. The forest has erased direction. The Ranger patrol is moving fast, now splitting into smaller elements. Angling away from the road, crossing terrain the Germans will not follow easily. Distances open. Sound fades. Contact dissolves. Within minutes. The ambush exists only as a memory and a problem to be explained. The Germans hold the road again, but they do not control it. Movement slows. Advance guards increase. Confidence drains away and miles from the kill zone. The Rangers regroup silently at the first rally point present accounted for. Breathing hard but intact. They have done the impossible. They have struck a force 10 times their size and escaped without pursuit. But the full impact of what they accomplished will only become clear when the consequences ripple outward from that narrow forest road to commanders who must now rethink how safe any movement truly is. 6:27 hours. 9 minutes after the first shot, the Germans finally attempt pursuit. Small elements edge into the trees, moving cautiously, weapons raised. They advance only a few meters at a time, stopping often, listening for movement that never comes. The forest offers no answers, only dead leaves, broken branches, and too many places to be watched from. What the Germans do not know is that the Rangers are already gone from the immediate area. The patrol has split exactly as planned. Pairs peel off along divergent paths. One element angles uphill, using elevation to break scent and sound. Another drops into a shallow ravine where water and mud erase footprints. A third crosses an old logging track briefly, just long enough to leave misleading signs, then vanishes. Back into dense cover, no one moves straight back. This matters. German pursuit doctrine depends on direction. Once direction is lost, speed collapses. Commanders hesitate to commit larger forces blindly into forested terrain without artillery or reconnaissance. The ambush has taught them caution, and caution buys time. At the second rally point, the patrol pauses just long enough to count heads. Everyone is there. Weapons are checked. Ammunition is redistributed. No one speaks above a whisper. The decision is made to keep moving. Distance is safety now. A third rally point lies miles away. Beyond a ridgeline and across a marsh, the Germans are unlikely to cross quickly. As the Rangers move, the sound of engines reaches them faintly from behind. German trucks. Reinforcements? Too late. The Germans have secured the road. But the road is no longer the objective. The patrol's purpose was never to hold ground. It was to strike, confuse, and escape. That objective has already been met. Back at the ambush site, German officers attempt to reconstruct events. Casualty counts vary. Reports conflict. Some soldiers insist they faced a company-sized force. Others claim fire came from 3 directions at once. No one can explain where the attackers went. Maps are spread. Orders are issued to increase security on all movements along similar routes. Advance guards are reinforced. Columns slow. The road network once assumed usable becomes a series of potential traps. That is the true turning point. The ambush does not end with gunfire. It ends with hesitation spreading outward. German units begin to move differently, more cautiously, more slowly, diverting resources to protection rather than progress. For the Rangers, the mission is not yet over. They move until late morning, stopping only when the patrol leader judges the distance sufficient. Only then do they rest briefly, hidden in terrain that swallows sound and sight. Radios come out. A short, coded transmission is sent. Nothing more. Hours later, the patrol slips back through friendly lines. There is no fanfare. Higher command listens to the report, then asks the same question repeatedly. How did they get away? The answer is unsatisfying to anyone who expects a single trick or stroke of luck. They got away because they planned to, because they never intended to stay, because they understood that against overwhelming numbers, the decisive action is knowing exactly when to leave on leaving. Before the enemy realizes that is what has happened, the ambush is already over, but its consequences are just beginning. The patrol returned without announcement. There were no cheers waiting behind the lines, no immediate recognition. The Rangers reported in quietly, weapons still dirty, uniforms streaked with mud and leaves. The story they told sounded improbable, even to officers who had seen years of combat. A single patrol, 1 ambush, 80 enemy troops, no pursuit. Initial skepticism was natural. Staff officers asked for clarification. Maps were pulled out. Distances were measured. Timings were checked. The numbers did not change. The patrol leader repeated the same details, calmly, without embellishment. Terrain, timing, withdrawal routes. Nothing heroic, nothing theatrical, just execution. German reports began filtering in soon after. Captured documents and intercepted. Communications confirmed confusion along the route. Movement had halted. Units had been delayed. Reinforcements had been diverted to secure roads previously considered safe. Casualty estimates varied, but the disruption was undeniable. What mattered most was not the body count. It was the effect. German columns in the area began traveling with heavier security. Advance elements were reinforced. Halts became more frequent. Schedules slipped. In a phase of the war where time and momentum were already scarce, delay carried strategic weight. For the Rangers' parent unit, the ambush validated doctrine. Small patrols, properly trained and trusted, could impose outsized effects without engaging in prolonged combat. The patrol had not captured ground, but it had shaped behavior. German commanders now treated terrain differently because of what might be hidden in it. Higher headquarters took note. This was not a one-off incident. Similar patrol actions were already occurring elsewhere, but this ambush illustrated the principle with unusual clarity. It showed that dominance did not require numbers. It required initiative, discipline, and a clear understanding of when to disengage. The patrol's success did not change the course of the war on its own, but it changed the calculus in its sector. German movements slowed. Allied forces advanced. With fewer surprises, roads once used freely became liabilities. Every bend, every forest edge, every narrow pass now carried the memory of unseen Rangers. For the men who carried out the ambush, the aftermath was quieter. They cleaned weapons, repacked gear, slept when they could. No one spoke much about what had happened. Among Rangers, success was measured in being ready for the next mission, not in retelling the last one, but the knowledge lingered. They had faced overwhelming odds and survived not by luck, but by design. And as the front continued to move, the implications of that design would ripple outward, shaping how both sides approached the war that followed. The long-term meaning of the ambush unfolded gradually. German commanders did not rewrite doctrine overnight. but habits changed. Roads that had once been treated as routine movement corridors were now approached with suspicion. Advance guards increased in size. Flank security widened. Columns slowed to accommodate caution. That caution had a cost. Slower movement meant delayed reinforcements, delayed supplies, delayed responses to Allied advances already pressing on multiple fronts. In late 1944, Germany could afford none of those delays. For Allied forces, the lesson reinforced an emerging truth. The battlefield was no longer defined solely by divisions and corps. It was shaped by what small units could do between those formations. Patrols became tools, not just of reconnaissance, but of disruption. Ranger doctrine gained quiet validation. Commanders trusted patrol leaders more. Autonomy increased, rather than decreased. Missions emphasized freedom of decision at the lowest level, accepting risk in exchange for adaptability. The patrol's success became a reference point not as legend, but as proof of concept. Importantly, the ambush did not encourage reckless aggression. The lesson was restraint. Strike only when terrain, timing, and withdrawal aligned. Avoid contact when those conditions were absent. Survival was not secondary to success, was part of it. German forces adapted where they could, but adaptation required resources they no longer had. More men assigned to security meant fewer available for offense. More time spent clearing. Routes meant less time advancing or regrouping. Each adjustment narrowed already limited options. In this way, the ambush exerted influence beyond its immediate area. It contributed to a broader erosion of German operational freedom, not through destruction alone, but through uncertainty. Movement required thought. Thought required time. Time favored the Allies. For the Rangers involved, the event faded into routine. There were more patrols, more nights in the cold, more decisions made far from oversight. The ambush became one experience among many, significant, but not singular. That was its true power. It was not an anomaly. It was representative. By the winter of 1944-45, small unit actions like this were shaping the Western Front everywhere, forcing a numerically strained enemy to react rather than act, to defend movement instead of choosing it. The war would still be decided by armies, but those armies moved, slowed, and hesitated because of what small groups of men could do when they struck hard and disappeared. And with that understanding firmly in place, the story turns from consequence to meaning. War often measures success in ground taken or enemies destroyed, but some victories leave no markers on a map. The Ranger patrol that ambushed a force, many times its size, did not win by holding the road or wiping out the column. It won by redefining the encounter itself. The ambush was never meant to be decisive in the traditional sense. It was meant to disrupt, confuse, and vanish. That distinction matters. Modern warfare rewards those who understand when violence serves purpose and when restraint preserves it. The Rangers did not stay to prove courage. They left to preserve momentum. In doing so, they denied the enemy clarity, speed, and confidence. Numbers did not protect the German column. Terrain did not warn it. Routine betrayed it. What saved the Rangers was not luck, preparation. A plan designed around escape rather than endurance. Leadership measured in timing rather than bravado. Trust built long before the first shot was fired. History often celebrates the loudest moments. This was not one of them. It was quiet, brief, almost invisible. Yet its impact spread outward, slowing movements, reshaping behavior, forcing an enemy to see every forest and every road bend as a potential threat. That is the legacy of small unit warfare. Not domination, but influence. Not conquest, but control. Of tempo. In November 1944, on a narrow road in Western Europe, single Ranger patrol proved that survival itself could be a strategic act. By choosing when to fight and when to leave, they demonstrated a truth that would shape modern infantry doctrine long after the war ended. Sometimes, the most powerful statement on a battlefield is absence. The enemy advances and finds no one there.